Hey everybody. So last night I tried to record a video and my cat came in the room and decided to try to speak over me. Um, so today we're going to start off with the first section of DSI, and we're going to do it a little bit differently because this is the only time this weekend I have free. My wife and daughter are at a doctor's appointment, and so I'm playing dad. So this will be an interesting video to say the least. He might wake up, he might stir, he might, you know, do whatever it is he does. But we're going to go ahead and get started and try to get this first chapter done. So it says the first day of DSI. So let's talk a little bit about what qualitative and quantitative research are. Let's talk about the differences to some extent. So they both together have a common goal, and that goal is to make valid inferences and identify the causal links. So what are these? So a valid inference is determining what's happening in the real world based on observational data. And identifying the causal link simply means identify something that what caused B. So did A cause B? Did C cause B? Identify the causal link, what made B happen. And the goal of qualitative and quantitative research, in large part, is to do entirely the same thing, is to make that up, is to make and identify that causal link. So quantitative research is work that engages with numerical, measurable processes and then takes those specific occurrences which is observing, abstracts them into numbers, and then uses those numbers through statistical processes to test broad hypotheses and attempt to find evidence that the theory that you're employing is actually correct. Qualitative work is a bit different. Qualitative work generally does not deal in numbers. It can have numbers, but it's not examining quantified data. It's not using statistics to actually engage in its process. It examines one cases or a few cases, a group of cases, either through rich detailed interviews or embedding yourself into the environment, what we call participant observer, to understand how an event or an occurrence took place. So it's much more a hands-on, on the ground, within the environment type of research. Whereas quantitative research is somewhat abstracted. It takes these events that have taken place or the process which you wish to examine, abstracts it into numbers, and then uses statistics to analyze that event. So while they both have the same goal, and that's identifying those causal links, they go through it through very different processes. Now, there has been a divide within political science and social science more generally between these two schools. And the reason for that is sort of twofold. First, quantitative methods, even in the really past 15 years since I've been a social scientist, have gotten exceedingly complex. And as these quantitative methods have gotten exceedingly complex, qualitative scholars, not trained in statistical analysis, find it very difficult to actually be able to digest the research that quantitative scholars are putting out. If that was the entirety of the problem, there probably wouldn't be as much of a divide. But there's another side to that. Quantitative researchers, all bent up on that what they're doing is the only way to be scientific, often dismiss qualitative research. They say that the findings aren't generalizable, that it isn't replicable, because of a variety of reasons, some quantitative scholars absolutely dismiss any qualitative research out of hand. And while it wasn't as bad as when I started out about 15 years ago, these biases still exist within the field. And so that's something that you should know, because it's really this question about the divide. It's this question about what differentiates qualitative versus quantitative research that sort of motivates this book. So the purpose of designing a social inquiry is to develop a logic, a seamless logic that for research that can be applied both to qualitative and quantitative work. So the goal of this book is to come up with sort of a general theory, a general practice by which both quantitative and qualitative work can be conducted under, And that logic is to follow the scientific method in a very systematic fashion, so that both qualitative and quantitative work sort of meet the standards of what rigorous science looks like. So the primary concern is that the work be empirical in nature, which simply means that either qualitative or quantitative, that the methods they use conform to the scientific method or process. So empirical in nature simply means observable. It doesn't necessarily mean quantifiable. We tend to use empirics. When we say empirics, we tend to mean quantification, but that's not the case. Empirical evidence can come in the form of interviews. So what they simply mean is that this has to be empirical and conform to scientific method or process. So why is the method so important? Why do you have a course called Research Methods in Political Science? Well, the reason is the actual method is the science part of political science. Without the method, we would just be fans of politics. We might have a deep understanding of politics, but we wouldn't actually be generating knowledge about politics. That's why the method itself is so important. And you have to understand that the method is the scientific method. And with that comes some very important caveats. First off, if we can't replicate the method or findings, then what we've done simply isn't scientific. In my context, what that means is if I can't give someone my data and they can't replicate the study I did through my data, then what I did wasn't scientific. I basically made it up. And so that ability to replicate findings and replicate findings using the same method is pretty tantamount to actually engaging in science. And that's why the method part of political science is so important. And that's really sort of central to this book, is that this idea of replication applies equally to qualitative and quantitative work, but it's different because it's sometimes very hard to replicate qualitative work. So we have to put in an effort up front to make sure that the work is replicable or as close to replicable as we can get. So the first part of this real process is coming up with the research question. And I can tell you that this is really the loosest area of the scientific method because there simply exists no consistent method for developing new ideas. As someone whose employment is in large part based on research, the process of coming up with new ideas of what to research or new methods by which to research, it's difficult. My colleagues and I were at the beginning of this year, at the beginning of 2020, were undertaking a book project examining what state court judges do while they're not judging. Because we had some assumption that from previous research that examined how judges use social media, that some judges were going to be much more public, whereas other judges were going to be much more private. Well, then COVID hit. And now we're writing a book on how state judiciaries respond to COVID. And how did we come up with that question? Well, it was pretty much thrown upon us because we couldn't do our other research. Another really difficult part of coming up with a research question is the question has to be important. I'm never actually sure what this means. I think a lot of research that other people don't find important is important. And so this ultimately becomes very difficult to define. And lastly, in terms of the research question, sort of help to guide us to this idea of what our research question should be, the work must advance understanding within a scientific field. And so these are not really good guidelines to get you to a research question. But a research question at its most central should be something that interests you and something you feel would interest other people. And that's the best sort of guidance that we can give you in this regard. So another guidance in terms of the book in chapter 1 is they discuss how we should improve our theory. And I think most social science is sort of lacking in terms of theory. And so the first guidance they give is that the theory driving the research has to be able to be wrong, which is to say that you can falsify your theory. So why is that so important? Well, in social science, research at it is an attempt to falsify your own theory. So the theory that you come up with, for example, I'll use our research that we're doing now. When it comes to how quick states adopted remote court, so basically Zoom court, think of it that way. So what affected how quick states adopted that? Well, our theory is states that already had a large degree of technology embedded within their systems, and states which had judges that were much more wedded to technology. And one of our proxies there is, does the majority of the state court use Twitter? We expected that those courts would be much more likely to innovate, controlling for everything else that could possibly affect that. Now, our theory is absolutely falsifiable. It could be something as simple as the courts that were most likely to engage in remote hearings were the courts that were the closest to heavy outbreaks early on in the pandemic. But our research is to attempt to falsify it. So we're going to throw every alternative explanation at our theory as possible. And one way in which to actually make this easier is to get more observations, because that provides a greater chance for you to be able to falsify your theory. So we have a problem in our research. There are 52 state high courts, and yes, 52 is the correct number there. Texas has 2 and Oklahoma has 2 as well. So there are 52 state high courts. That means our number of observations is 52, except in our case it's not. So there are 52 state high courts, but the way we're analyzing it is how quick does it take those courts to actually implement innovation? And so how quickly means that we have 52 observations daily. And so our number of observations very quickly grows and allows us to throw more alternative explanations against our theory. Now, your theory has to be exacting. It has to be very precise, and you have to identify the moving parts of it. Because if your theory is not overly specific, it's really difficult to falsify. Think if you have a vague theory, this person does this because some broad explanation, then it's very difficult to prove that theory wrong. So theories have to be exacting in their detail. And that's one of the easiest ways to sort of improve our scientific method, both in qualitative and quantitative work. Very specifically and deliberately lay out the moving parts of your theory so that you can subject them to evidence to the contrary. And lastly, we're going to talk about data. Now, it might seem odd to talk about data in a qualitative versus quantitative sort of discussion, but the book does a good idea of making sure that we all think that qualitative research also has data in a very different way than quantitative research has data. I will pull up a spreadsheet and there will be cells and there'll be numbers in it, and that's my data. For qualitative research, their data doesn't look like that. That doesn't mean they don't have data. So the first guidance that the book gives is make sure you record and report how the data is collected. That is paramount because replicability can only happen if we know how the data was collected. And if the data was collected by being a participant observer in some event. Let's take, for example, the protests that are going on right now in Belarus. Let's say that I'm certain there is a social scientist who is there embedded in those protests, actually examining and studying what's going on. Now, those things are happening at a finite point in time. In terms of replicability, a researcher that comes along, let's say a year from now, isn't going to be able to replicate the data that that researcher is gathering in Belarus because the environment simply doesn't exist. But if you know exactly how the data was collected, you know the method by which that information was gathered, well, then we can easily make the argument that if conditions were the same, any of us could have entered that environment and collected that data. And so while it's not technically replicable, meaning that no one else could collect that data, the method by which you followed is replicable. And another way to sort of get beyond this is make sure you collect as much data as possible while you're in that environment, because more data is simply better. More observations are better. It makes your analysis more robust. Now, another thing that we need to focus on is make sure that the concepts that we want to measure, so the moving parts in our theory, make sure the concepts that we want to measure are actually what we're measuring and not something else. There are many instances where what we use, and at least in quantitative research, we use what are called proxy variables, which are variables that measure some easily observable quantity, but we actually use them as indicators for something else that's much more difficult to be observed. If you can really defend that proxy measure, that's absolutely all right. But if you can't, and if you're in the field, and if you're measuring something that you think you're measuring something, but you're actually measuring something entirely different, you have a problem, because bad data simply leads to bad research. If your data is not good, your findings aren't going to be good, or at the very least believable. And lastly for today, the book urges to make sure your data collection techniques are reliable. Now, we're going to talk in more depth in the upcoming weeks, or in the upcoming classes, about the difference between reliability and validity. But just to put this out there, what a reliable data collection technique means is that every time you would collect that piece of data, you were doing it in the same way, so that when you measure something at time A and time B and time C, all of them have been measured the same way, and therefore all of that data is reliable and comparable. Doesn't necessarily mean it's accurate. The idea of accuracy is validity, and we'll talk about that in the next class. So this is just a brief introduction of qualitative versus quantitative research with our guest partner here today. And I'll have another video out for you probably sometime next week, in which we will examine Chapter 2. Thanks.